hold on. Let's get the ladder.
Nine mapismi Xuquetzpaltzin. Yo me llamo Mapismi Xuquetzpaltzin o Paz. Good afternoon. My name is Paz or Mapitzmitl Xuquetzpaltzin, which is my native name. I am from Albuquerque, New Mexico. I'm a visual artist and sometimes performance artist, but mainly a visual artist for a living, which means that I paint, I sculpt, I work with monumental ceramic tile murals, and I make jewelry. And I think one thing that many people are not aware of when we talk about Dia de los Muertos, Day of the Dead, or Dia de Muertos as it's called in Mexico, they leave out the los, is that here in the New World,
Okay. Next.
it had one beginning, and in Europe it had another beginning, and then it really became a mixture, the same as many of us are. Many of us carry Native American and Hispanic blood, and the Day of the Dead, or Dia de los Muertos, became a mixture or a mestizaje of concepts, ideas, and things of that nature. Something most people are not aware of is that here in Anahuac, before the arrival of Spaniards or any European en masse to this continent, we celebrated our ceremony for the dead. And it wasn't called Day of the Dead, it was called Mikaiwit, which means, or We Mikaiwit, which means either the celebration of the dead or the great celebration of the grand celebration of the dead. And it was practiced in the month of September, as we know the months nowadays. During this ceremony, the people would leave on Tlamanallis, and Tlamanalli is a word that means an offering that has been placed. We call an offering a wensintli or a wentli, but a tlalmanali is an offering that has been placed. So once an offering has been placed, it becomes a tlalmanali. And you could kind of equate it to an altar without having any, have to have any religious, strictly religious overtones to it. And on this tlalmanali or offering, the favorite foods of beloved ones who had departed this world, maybe their tools. If they were a carpenter, they could put a saw there, or a hammer, things of that nature. If they were a hunter, a bow and arrow, or a lance, these were placed there also. And they're placed there with the idea that their essence remains with us, and it would come back and visit these favorite articles that the people enjoyed while they were alive. It's just a nice way of us remembering that life and death are intertwined. Well, when the Spaniards came, they came from Europe, of course, and they brought with them several traditions. They brought with them a very ancient tradition that predated Christianity, and it was called All Hallows Eve, which we celebrate as Halloween now on October 31st. And then they had Dia de Santos y Fieles Difuntos. They have All Saints Days and All Souls Day, and those came on November 1st and 2nd. So as the Spanish Christianized the native population, the indigenous population, one of the things they did was they changed the date of Mikaiwik to the day of the Day of the Dead, of All Souls, All Saints Day and All Souls Day. And that's how Dia de Muertos came to be. And exactly when this change took place is unknown to me. But I know that it happened within the very first century of this encounter and of the subjugation of the indigenous peoples of Mesoamerica. Well, depending on where you go, it runs a full spectrum from being very primal and very pre-Columbian in essence to being completely modern. For instance, another little known fact is that the big Dia de Muertos parade that happens in Mexico City was only begun for a James Bond movie. Previous to this time, before Daniel Craig hit Mexico City, they did not have that giant parade, and it's a beautiful, wonderful, and gorgeous thing, but it's relatively new, so that's a completely modern aspect of Day of the Dead, and the people are dressed up as witches, as ghosts, as things that, correlate more closely with Halloween than they would with the original Mikaiwitl. Or if you go to a little village that's part of the megalopolis of Mexico City, but it's its own village, it's only maybe 20 miles away, you find people visiting grave sites, laying tlalmanalis, and practicing this Day of the Dead or this Festival of the Dead in a way that it has been done since before the encounter with Europeans. Oaxaca, as you mentioned, is actually a stronghold. It's a place where the Day of the Dead celebration has held on to its roots. But it was not a very popular place until recently either. So nowadays you find throughout Mexico, if one is going to travel there for Day of the Dead, be ready for a lot of crowds from all different nations, and for the flavor to have changed just by the sheer number of people who are descending upon these small villages anymore. It's just about impossible to find a place where it's just done in a super simplistic manner anymore. And I'm not to say this is good or bad, but this is the modern world. This is another aspect of traditional culture that has been appropriated by the modern world. And I use the word appropriation for what it is, just for whatever its definition is. I don't attach any political significance to it. It's like any other word. It can be functional or it can be non-functional, just depending on how we utilize it and how we practice it. So the world at large, I mean, first it was just the United States, but now the world at large has sort of appropriated Day of the Dead because it's something that we all hold in common. It helps the people of Europe to remember their ancient days, the days even before the Celtic people, the days before the Druids. It helps people in the United States as we, as an adolescent country, try to form a viable culture, which I have no doubt we will have one day if we can exist for another couple of hundred years. We will have a viable American culture. And right now we're at the place where we are taking from this culture and that culture and inserting different aspects of cultural viability into our modern day lives, and they will coalesce at some point if we can continue to exist as a nation. They will coalesce into an American culture. And I think it's really that the Day of the Dead has been one of the more wonderful celebrations that has been appropriated from Mexico, because if you look at Cinco de Mayo, or the 5th of May, it's essentially a drunk fest, and that's why we like to call it Drinko de Mayo instead of Cinco de Mayo. But Dia de los Muertos, people tend to have a lot of fun with it, but there is a reverence that's attached to it. And I'm not saying that there's misuse of it, but people tend to be more reverent about it. One thing that this country has lacked is an intimate relationship with death. And I think that Dia de los Muertos helps us as Americans to establish that intimate relationship with our deaths. To me, as a Chicano or Chicanindio, Day of the Dead means continuity, because we were already practicing it on this side of the border. We were practicing it in a very reserved, very New Mexican way. We would just go visit our loved ones in the Panteon, in the cemetery. We'd go visit our loved ones. We would leave flowers. Sometimes we would take a picnic with us. And remember, I'm just talking about how from the side of my family that has been in New Mexico for many, many, many generations. This was just how it was done. It was very simply, and it was done after Halloween, of course. So for All Souls Day, we would all go to church. For All Saints Day, we would all go to church, and for All Souls Day, we would go to the cemetery. And that's what it meant growing up as a native Chicano. As the Chicano movement manifested itself in the 60s and the 70s, there began to be more interchange with Mexico, even though we are talking about Chicanos. More aspects of what would be considered to be the Mexican Dia de Muertos were integrated into the Chicano community. So to us it meant candy first, then it meant church, then it meant going and talking with our dearly departed, going and having a conversation with them, because their essence was there with us for the day. That's what I remember from my childhood. I think the message that I like to give here, and it's not only for white people, it's for our own people who have been detribalized, it's for Native Americans, it's for people of any ethnicity, is that if we want to talk about cultural appropriation in the modern sense of the term, I like to say that for me the difference between cultural appropriation and cultural sharing I'm going to give general guidelines, then I'll be specific, is number one, either be invited into the ceremony or the cultural aspect that you wish to learn, or ask permission and be accepted. After that happens, practice that tradition until it is your own. Don't just go one time and then, act like you made it up, or like you're an expert at it. Practice it until it is your own, the same as anything, until you can feel it inside of you. You know that it is yours because you're comfortable with it. Third, always give recognition to where you got your learning from, because that's all the tradition is. Tradition is like a chain or a rope. We call it mecayotl in our native language, which means the essence of rope. In English, thinking of it as a chain is probably easier. So think of it as a chain, and that chain is only as long as the amount of links that it has. So if we learn something, then we don't say where it came from. We have broken that chain, and we are not practicing a tradition any longer. So for it to be traditional, we need to honor where it came from. And this is a really wonderful concept because it works in two different ways. Number one, you have honored where you came from. Number two, if the person who taught it to you erroneously, the responsibility goes back on them. So it's not on you because you've done the best that you can. And then last but not least, this rule is extremely important. Recognize that each person, each family, each community, each ethnic group throughout this world, I don't use the word race because I only think of the human race in terms of race, unless we're talking about plant people, animal people, things of that nature. Every one of us has a secret, sacred space. If we are allowed to keep that space, then we are more willing to share. If that space is invaded, then we close up and we can't share because we have been violated. So it's not our duty, it's not our responsibility, and it's never a step we should take to try to invade the sacred space of any other culture. So allow each person, each family, each culture to have their sacred space and enjoy what is given to you freely. And if we follow those 4 steps, then we can call it, at least I say we can call it, cultural sharing as opposed to cultural appropriation. And that's really what humanity is about sharing. So what I would tell a person specifically, if they want to learn Day of the Dead, I would say first, if you know where you came from, go back and see how your people celebrated this because they had the same celebration. And then once you learn how they celebrated it, see if there is a way that you can connect that to the way that we as natives from this hemisphere celebrate it. And that connection is what's going to cause it to grow and get stronger and be more joyful, because then we will have a sharing.